The church was packed. 200 people dressed in black, a father lying in his casket, his daughter standing beside him, barely holding herself together. Then the doors opened. Her husband walked in, but he was not alone. Beside him was a woman, young, pregnant. 7 months pregnant. His hand rested on her belly like a declaration, like a challenge, like he wanted every single person in that room to see exactly what he had done. Gasps, whispers, a hymnal hitting the floor. And his wife? She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She looked at him once, just once. Then she turned away and kept greeting guests as if the ground beneath her had not just cracked wide open. He thought she was powerless. He thought her father left behind nothing but a modest house and an old truck. He thought this was his moment to walk away clean. He had no idea that the will had already been executed. He had no idea the accounts had already been sealed. And he had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman he had just humiliated in front of her father's memory had inherited $300 million. Every satisfying moment of what happens next, he earned himself. The lesson. This story will teach you something most people learn too late. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And the person who controls the outcome is never the loudest one in the room. It is the one who prepared while everyone else was performing. If you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off by someone who confused your kindness for weakness, this story was made for you. If that opening gave you chills, wait until you hear the ending. Stay until the last word. I promise it will be worth every minute. And if stories about quiet strength, real justice, and dignity that does not need applause matter to you, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on the notification bell so the next story finds you before anyone else. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if this story resonates with someone you know, share it. Sometimes the right story reaches the right person at exactly the right moment.
The funeral hall was silent when Mark Garrison walked in. His hand rested on the belly of another woman. Brooke Calloway was 7 months pregnant. Her dress was tight. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like a countdown nobody asked for. Mark did not lower his head. He did not let go of her hand. He walked forward with the confidence of a man who believed the room owed him something. Emily Whitman stood by her father's casket, dressed in black, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She had been greeting guests for the past 40 minutes. She had shaken hands with people who had known her father for decades. She had accepted condolences with a grace that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. When the doors opened and Mark appeared with Brooke beside him, conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman in the third pew dropped her hymnal. The sound echoed through the church like a small explosion that nobody acknowledged. Emily saw them immediately. She saw Brooke's belly. She saw Mark's hand. She saw the way he scanned the room, measuring his own impact the way a man checks his reflection before walking into a meeting. The faintest tremor crossed Emily's jaw. It lasted less than a second. Then she turned back to the elderly couple she had been speaking with and continued the conversation as if the ground beneath her feet had not just shifted. Every person in that church assumed they knew who the victim was. Every single one of them was wrong. If you believe that silence can be louder than a scream, stay with this story until the end. Drop where you are watching from and what time it is right now. And if quiet, strength, and justice matter to you, consider subscribing before this story is over, because the ending will change the way you think about dignity forever. Emily Whitman lived the kind of life that nobody wrote stories about. She worked at the county library in a small town outside Charlotte, North Carolina. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear bumper that she never got fixed because fixing it felt like an unnecessary expense. She brought casseroles to sick neighbors. She remembered everyone's birthday. She returned shopping carts to the corral, even when it was raining. She was the kind of woman people described as nice, and they meant it as both a compliment and a limitation. Her husband, Mark Garrison, was the opposite. Mark filled rooms. He spoke first at dinner parties. He laughed loudly at his own jokes and waited for others to join in. He worked as a regional sales director for a medical supply company, and he talked about his career the way some men talked about professional sports, with an intensity that suggested the stakes were far higher than they actually were. Mark had married Emily 8 years ago in a small ceremony at the same white steeple church where her father would eventually be laid to rest. At the time, he told his friends he admired her calmness. She was steady, he said, grounded, the kind of woman who would let him chase whatever he needed to chase without creating drama. What Mark actually meant, though he would never have said it this plainly, was that Emily would not compete with him for attention. And for the first few years, that arrangement worked. Emily supported him without interference. She remembered his meetings. She ironed his shirts when he had early flights. She handled the logistics of their shared life with an efficiency that Mark mistook for simplicity. He never asked whether she wanted more. He assumed her silence on the subject was an answer. At neighborhood gatherings, Mark performed the role of charming husband with practiced ease. He told stories that positioned himself at the center. He complimented Emily in ways that sounded generous but carried a subtle edge. At a barbecue one summer, standing in their neighbor's backyard with a beer in his hand, Mark said to a group of couples gathered around the grill, "Emily's idea of excitement is a new bookmark." Everyone laughed. Emily smiled. She had heard variations of this joke before. She knew her role in the bit. She was the straight man, the setup. The punchline was always Mark's. But Karen Fitzsimmons, standing 3 feet away with a plate of potato salad she had made from a recipe she swore was her grandmother's, but was actually from Pinterest, caught something in Emily's eyes. A flicker, brief, almost invisible. Like a match struck in a dark room that burned out before it could catch. Karen said nothing, but she remembered it. She would remember it for a long time. Emily did not fight back, not because she could not because she lacked the words, but because Emily had learned very early in life that fighting required an audience, and audiences required performance, and performance required energy. She preferred to invest elsewhere. Her father had taught her that. Robert Whitman was a quiet man in the way that certain mountains are quiet. Not because they lacked force, but because their force did not require announcement. He lived in a modest ranch house on 3 acres outside Charlotte. He drove a Ford truck he had owned for 12 years. He wore the same brown jacket to church every Sunday until the elbows wore thin, and then he patched them rather than buying a new one. Neighbors assumed Robert was comfortable, maybe a retired contractor, maybe a man who had done well enough with a small business and invested carefully. Nobody asked directly because Robert did not invite financial conversation. He talked about weather, about woodworking, about the tomatoes he grew in his backyard that were always better than anyone else's, but that he never bragged about. What nobody knew, what even Emily did not fully understand until much later, was that Robert Whitman had built and sold 3 companies between 1985 and 2005. He had invested the proceeds with the same patience he applied to everything else. He had grown those investments across decades, compounding quietly, avoiding attention the way some people avoided debt. Robert Whitman was worth $300 million. He lived in a ranch house because he wanted to. He drove an old truck because it still worked. He wore a patched jacket because waste offended him more than appearances ever could. And He watched his son-in-law with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what carelessness looked like when it believed itself invisible. One Sunday after dinner, Mark excused himself early. Something about a call he needed to make. His chair scraped the floor as he stood. He did not push it back in. The front door closed behind him a moment later, and Emily heard his car start in the driveway. Robert sat across from his daughter at the kitchen table. The dishes were still between them. He did not mention Mark's departure directly. Instead, he asked a question that seemed, on the surface, unrelated. Does he show up when things are difficult? Emily hesitated. She wanted to say yes. She wanted the answer to be simple. But Robert Whitman had raised her to respect the difference between what she wished were true and what she observed to be true. He tries, she said carefully. Robert nodded slowly. Then he said something Emily would carry with her for years. A man who cannot sit still at your table will not stand beside you when it matters. Emily did not argue. She did not defend Mark. She absorbed the words the way she absorbed everything her father said, quietly, completely, and with the understanding that he was rarely wrong about people. Robert stood, cleared his plate, and changed the subject to tomatoes. But later that night, alone in his study, he made a phone call to a man named Daniel Mercer. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Robert opened a drawer, removed a folder he had been adding to for 3 years, and placed it on his desk. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. The preparations had already begun. Mark Garrison met Brooke Calloway at a regional sales conference in Raleigh on a Tuesday in October. She was 29. She worked as a receptionist at a competing firm. She had auburn hair, an easy laugh, and a habit of asking questions that made the person she was talking to feel like the most interesting man in the room. This was not manipulation exactly. It was instinct. Brooke understood attention the way a plant understood sunlight. She turned toward it naturally. Mark noticed her at the hotel bar during a networking mixer. She was standing alone, holding a glass of white wine, looking just uncomfortable enough to seem approachable. He walked over and introduced himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in a way he believed. Their conversation lasted 2 hours. Brooke laughed at his stories. She asked about his career with what felt like genuine interest. She told him he seemed like someone who was going places, and Mark absorbed that compliment the way dry ground absorbs rain. By the end of the evening, he had her phone number. By the end of the week, he had texted her 14 times. By the end of the month, they were meeting for dinners that Mark described to Emily as client obligations. The affair did not begin with passion or moral collapse. It began with conversation, with complaints shared over drinks, with a slow erosion of a boundary that Mark had never respected enough to maintain. Brooke asked questions that Emily had stopped asking years ago. How was your day? What are you working toward? Do you feel appreciated? Mark told himself these were things a man needed: affirmation, excitement, the sense that someone recognized his potential. He told himself Emily had stopped providing them. He told himself the affair was a symptom of a marriage that had already failed. Each justification built on the last until betrayal no longer felt like a choice. It felt like inevitability. Emily noticed the shift before she could name it. The signs were small at first. A phone angled away at the dinner table. A new password on his laptop. A sudden interest in his appearance that had nothing to do with her. Mark began speaking about ambition with a sharpened edge, as if the word justified a growing impatience with the life he shared with his wife. He criticized her more. Her cooking lacked creativity. Her schedule was too predictable. She never wanted to do anything exciting. The complaints were never loud enough to qualify as arguments. They existed in the space between conversation and accusation, the kind of chronic, low-grade contempt that erodes a person so gradually they mistake the damage for normalcy. Emily did not confront him. She had learned from her father that confrontation only worked when you controlled the outcome. Without that control, all confrontation did was teach the other person how to lie more carefully. Instead, she began to observe. She noticed which nights Mark came home late and which mornings he left early. She noticed the restaurant charges on their shared credit card that did not match the restaurants they visited together. She noticed that his phone, which he had once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, now traveled with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. She did not snoop. She did not read his messages. She simply cataloged the pattern the way a meteorologist catalogs pressure changes. Not because a storm was guaranteed, but because preparation made survival possible. One evening in November, Emily found a receipt in the pocket of Mark's sport coat while hanging it in the closet. A jewelry store, a necklace, $412. Emily had not received a necklace. She stood in the closet holding that small slip of paper, and for a moment the room tilted, not with anger, with recognition. The kind of clarity that arrives when the last piece of evidence confirms what your body already knew, but your mind refused to assemble. Her hands trembled. She sat down on the bedroom floor, her back against the closet door, and pressed the receipt flat against her knee. She read it twice, then she picked up her phone and called her father. Robert answered on the first ring, the way he always did when Emily called after 9 at night. She could barely speak. Her voice came out in fragments. A receipt, a necklace. "I did not get a necklace, Dad." Robert listened without interruption. When she finished, the line was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Come to the house tomorrow. Bring nothing. Tell no one." Emily arrived at her father's ranch house the next morning at 10. The kitchen smelled like coffee. Robert was sitting at the table with a man Emily had met only twice before, a tall, silver-haired attorney named Daniel Mercer, who spoke in short sentences that landed like gavels. Robert slid a folder across the table. Emily opened it. Inside were documents she had never seen: trust agreements, asset summaries, beneficiary designations, account numbers. The language was dense, legal, precise, but the numbers were clear. $300 million. Emily's hands stopped moving. She looked at her father. "Why did you not tell me?" Robert met her gaze with the calm certainty of a man who had spent decades preparing for this exact question. "Because I needed you to become someone who did not need it. Now I need you to become someone who can protect it." Daniel Mercer explained the structure. The trust was irrevocable. It was designed to insulate assets from marital claim. No spouse, current or future, could access, influence, petition for its portion. Control was separated from visibility. Ownership was separated from display. Every clause anticipated a possibility that reasonable people would dismiss as improbable. Robert Whitman had never been a reasonable man. He had been a prepared one. Emily listened carefully. She asked questions. She took notes in the small notebook she always carried. When the meeting ended, she hugged her father longer than usual. He held her without speaking. Then he stepped back and said something she would replay in her mind many times in the months that followed. "You do not need his permission to be safe." Emily drove home that afternoon with the windows down and the radio off. The air was cool. The trees along the highway were beginning to turn. She felt something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not relief exactly. Not confidence. Something more structural than that. A foundation she had not known existed was now visible, and it changed the weight of everything above it. When she got home, Mark was on the couch watching television. He did not look up. "How is your dad?" he asked without interest. "Fine," Emily said. She walked into the bedroom, closed the door, and placed the folder in a locked drawer beside her passport. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall for a very long time. Here is something worth remembering. When someone mocks you publicly and frames it as humor, they are not joking. They are testing how much you will tolerate, and your tolerance becomes their permission. Robert Whitman was diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer on a Monday morning in January. The doctor delivered the news in a small office with fluorescent lighting and a framed diploma on the wall that nobody ever looked at. Robert sat in the chair across from the desk, his hands resting on his knees, his expression unchanged. Emily sat beside him. She had driven him to the appointment because he had mentioned feeling tired. And Emily had learned that when her father mentioned anything about his body, the situation was already serious. The doctor spoke carefully, choosing words designed to soften reality without obscuring it. He talked about options and timelines, and the importance of quality of life. Robert listened to all of it. Then he asked one question. How long? The doctor paused. Weeks, possibly a few months with treatment. Robert nodded. He thanked the doctor. He stood. He put on his brown jacket and walked to the parking lot with the same steady pace he used for everything. Emily followed. She did not cry in the office. She did not cry in the parking lot. She cried later, alone, in her car outside the library, with the engine running and the heater blowing warm air that did nothing to stop the shaking. She took leave from work the next day. She moved into her father's guest room with a small suitcase and a stack of books she would not open for weeks. She cooked his meals. She coordinated with doctors. She managed the medications, the appointments, the steady cascade of logistics that accompanied dying in America. Mark came to the first hospital visit. He sat stiffly in the chair across from the physician, his arms folded, his eyes drifting toward his phone every 30 seconds. When the doctor explained the treatment options, Mark asked one question. Is this manageable? He seemed relieved when the answer was not immediately catastrophic. After that, his visits became sporadic, then rare, then non-existent. Work is crazy right now, he told Emily on the phone. You know how the end of quarter gets. Emily did not challenge the excuse. She noted it. Mark sent texts instead. Short ones. Thinking of you. Hope Dad is hanging in there. Let me know if you need anything. The messages were consistent enough to create the appearance of concern without requiring actual presence. Emily saved every single one. During those weeks, something shifted between Emily and her father. The conversations became different. Not longer. Robert was never a man who wasted words, but deeper. He talked about things he had never discussed before, about her mother, who had died when Emily was 12, about the years after, when he had raised 2 daughters alone and discovered that grief did not diminish. It simply became part of the architecture. He talked about money, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of principle. Money makes people honest, he said one evening from his hospital bed, the monitors humming softly behind him. Not because it changes who they are, because it reveals who they always were. Emily nodded. People reveal themselves under strain, Robert continued. It is not cruelty, it is gravity. He asked her questions she would later understand were assessments. Did she understand the difference between ownership and control? Did she know how to protect something without displaying it? Did she trust systems more than emotions when emotions proved unreliable? Emily answered each one calmly. Yes, I understand. Robert watched her face as she spoke. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. He closed his eyes and rested. During this time, Daniel Mercer visited Robert privately. The meetings were brief discreet, and always scheduled when Mark was nowhere nearby. Documents were reviewed, clauses were strengthened. 3 additional protective provisions were added to the trust after Robert overheard Mark on the phone one evening during a rare visit talking to someone about quarterly numbers while his father-in-law lay in the next room connected to an IV drip. Robert did not confront Mark. He called Daniel instead. Claire arrived 2 weeks after the diagnosis. Emily's older sister flew in from Charleston on a Wednesday evening carrying a suitcase and an expression that combined exhaustion with something harder to name. Claire Whitman Douglas was 38, blunt, protective, and had not spoken to Emily in nearly 5 years. The estrangement had started over their father's secrecy. Claire had wanted Robert to enjoy his wealth, to travel, to live openly. Robert refused. He believed visibility invited distortion. They argued. Claire left. Emily, caught between loyalty to her father and love for her sister, chose peace, which Claire interpreted as choosing sides. Now Claire stood in the doorway of Robert's ranch house, looking at Emily with an expression that was equal parts relief and accusation. "You could have called me 6 months ago," Claire said. "You could have called me any time in 5 years," Emily replied. They stared at each other for a long moment. The hallway was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Then Claire dropped her bag on the floor and said, "Fine. We are both terrible. Where is Dad?" Claire's presence changed the texture of everything. She was louder than Emily, more direct, less patient with subtext. She asked questions Emily would not ask. She said things Emily only thought. When Mark called one evening and Emily answered with her usual quiet politeness, Claire stood in the kitchen doorway and mouthed the words, "Hang up on him," with an intensity that almost made Emily laugh. Almost, not quite, but almost. Robert's condition deteriorated steadily through February. He grew thinner. His movements slowed. His voice, once steady enough to anchor any conversation, became something Emily had to lean close to hear. But his mind remained sharp. He asked about Mark exactly once. Emily answered honestly. Robert listened. Then he said, "I am glad you understand the difference between what you wish were true and what you know to be true." Emily held his hand. She did not cry in front of him. She saved that for later, in the guest room, with the door closed and a pillow pressed against her face so that nobody would hear. Robert Whitman died on a Thursday morning in early March. Emily was beside him. The room was quiet. The monitors had been turned off hours earlier at his request. There were no dramatic last words. He simply looked at his daughter, and with a voice so soft it barely qualified as sound, he said, "You will be all right." Emily believed him. Claire arrived 17 minutes too late. She stood in the hallway outside his room, her hand on the wall, her shoulders shaking. Emily came out and held her. They stood like that for a long time, two sisters who had lost 5 years to stubbornness, reunited by the one man who had loved them both with equal ferocity and unequal methods. Mark sent a text 40 minutes later. "Sorry, babe. Let me know what you need for arrangements." He did not come that night. The will was read 3 days after Robert's death in Daniel Mercer's office, behind a door that locked from the inside. Only 3 people were present: Daniel, Emily, Claire. Daniel spoke without ceremony. He laid out the documents the way a carpenter lays out tools, each one placed precisely, each one necessary. Robert had left Claire $5 million outright. Generous by any standard. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Claire stared at the number and said nothing for several seconds. Then she looked at Emily. Daniel continued. "Everything else? The remaining $295 million in diversified holdings real estate, and investment accounts, was placed in an irrevocable trust with Emily as the sole beneficiary. The room was very quiet. Claire spoke first. "He always said you were the patient one." She paused. "Guess he meant it literally." Emily did not laugh. She looked at Daniel. "And Mark?" Daniel met her eyes. "Mark is not mentioned anywhere in these documents. Your father structured the trust specifically so that no spouse, current or future, could access, influence, or claim any portion. The assets are legally insulated from marital proceedings. This is yours, permanently." Emily nodded slowly. The number was staggering, but the structure was what mattered. Her father had not given her wealth as a gift. He had given it as protection. And protection, she understood, was a form of love that required no explanation. That evening, Emily and Claire sat on their father's back porch. The air was cool. The yard was dark. A bottle of wine sat between them, already half empty. Claire said, "So, what happens now?" Emily said, "The funeral. Then the rest." Claire looked at her sister carefully. "And Mark?" Emily took a long sip of wine. "Mark does not know about the trust. He does not know about any of it." Claire raised an eyebrow. "How?" Emily almost smiled. "He never asked." For one evening, Emily allowed herself to feel safe. She had resources. She had legal protection. She had her sister back. The wine was good. The porch was quiet. The stars above Charlotte did not care about trust documents or unfaithful husbands or grief that sat in your chest like a stone you could not swallow. For one evening, everything felt possible. That feeling would not last. The funeral was held on a Saturday. The white steeple church was full. Robert Whitman had been quietly respected in the community for decades, the kind of man whose absence people felt before they could articulate why. Emily arrived early with Claire. They stood near the casket, greeting guests with the careful warmth that funerals demand. People spoke softly. They touched Emily's arm. They said Robert was a good man, which was true, and that he was in a better place, which Emily appreciated without believing. Mark was supposed to arrive at 10. By 10:15, Emily checked her phone. No message. By 10:20, Claire's expression had shifted from concern to something darker. At 10:27, the church doors opened. Mark walked in. Brooke Calloway was beside him. Her belly was unmistakable at 7 months. Her dress was cream-colored, inappropriate for a funeral, in a way that seemed deliberate. Mark's hand rested on her abdomen. His posture was straight. His expression suggested not remorse, but declaration. The church fell silent. Not gradually, immediately. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot or a confession. Karen Fitzsimmons, sitting in the fourth row with her husband and her opinions, actually stood up. Then she sat back down, her mouth open, her potato salad temporarily forgotten. Claire gripped Emily's arm. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Tell me I am hallucinating." "You are not," Emily said. "I am going to kill him," Claire said. "Not in church," Emily replied. Claire's jaw tightened. "Fine. Parking lot." Emily watched Mark guide Brooke to a pew near the middle of the church. Watched him sit down without looking at her. Watched Brooke place her hand on her belly with a possessiveness that had nothing to do with motherhood and everything to do with territory. The whispers started. They moved through the pews like wind through wheat. Emily felt every single one of them. She felt the pity. She felt the judgment. She felt the curiosity of people who were already composing the version of this story they would tell at dinner. When it was time for Emily to deliver her reading, she walked to the podium on legs that felt borrowed from someone else. She opened the Bible to the passage her father had chosen months ago. She began to read. Her voice cracked on the second sentence. She stopped. The entire church watched. 200 people held their breath. Emily stood at the podium with her father's words in front of her and her husband's pregnant mistress in her line of sight. And for 3 seconds, that lasted a lifetime, she could not speak. Then she inhaled. She straightened her shoulders. She finished the reading without looking up again. When she returned to her seat, Claire reached over and held her hand without looking at her. Pastor Jim Briggs delivered the eulogy. He had known Robert for 40 years. His voice was calm, measured, unhurried, and every single sentence was a surgical instrument. Robert Whitman believed that character was what a man did when he thought nobody important was watching, Pastor Jim said. He believed that loyalty was not a word you said at the altar. It was a choice you made every single day after. He never looked at Mark. He did not need to. The entire church felt the weight of those words land exactly where they were aimed. After the service, Mark approached Emily outside. His expression suggested reasonableness, the practiced look of a man who had prepared his defense before the accusation. "I think we should talk about this like adults," he said. Claire stepped between them before Emily could respond. "Adults do not bring their pregnant girlfriend to a funeral, Mark. That is what children do when they want attention." Mark's face reddened. He looked at Emily over Claire's shoulder, searching for the ally he had always assumed she would be. Emily looked back at him with an expression he had never seen before. Not anger, not grief. Distance. The kind of distance that could not be closed with words. Mark walked away. Brooke followed, her confidence visibly diminished. That evening, Emily sat in her father's living room alone. Claire had gone to pick up food. The house was quiet. Emily's phone buzzed. A local gossip blog had posted photos from the funeral. Mark and Brooke walking up the aisle. Emily visible in the background, standing at the podium, looking broken. The headline read, "Scandal at Whitman Funeral. Husband's mistress steals the show." Emily stared at the screen. Her private grief was now public entertainment. The safety she had felt on the porch 2 nights ago, the wine and the stars, and the feeling that things might be okay, evaporated like fog under a heat lamp. When Claire returned with takeout containers and saw Emily's face, she set the food down and said, "What happened?" Emily handed her the phone. Claire read the headline. Then she said a word that would have made their father raise an eyebrow. Then she sat down beside Emily and said, "We are going to handle this. All of it. Every single piece." Emily nodded, but the tremor in her hands did not stop for hours. The fallout from the funeral moved faster than Emily expected. Within 48 hours, the gossip blog post had been shared across 3 local Facebook groups and a Reddit thread dedicated to small-town drama. Emily's name was not mentioned directly, but the church was named, the date was included, and anyone in the Charlotte area with a passing interest in other people's misery could connect the dots in minutes. Emily's supervisor at the county library called her on Monday morning. The conversation was brief, polite, and devastating. "Emily, we think it might be best if you took some additional leave, just until things settle down. People are talking, and we want to make sure the environment stays comfortable for everyone." Emily understood what comfortable for everyone meant. It meant comfortable for everyone except her. It meant that her husband's behavior at her father's funeral had somehow become her professional liability. She agreed to the leave without argument. She hung up the phone. Then she sat at her father's kitchen table and pressed her palms flat against the surface until the shaking stopped. Claire found her like that 20 minutes later. "What happened?" "The library," Emily said. "They want me to take leave. Because of the blog post. Because people are talking." Claire's expression cycled through 3 emotions in rapid succession. Confusion, anger, something colder and more productive than either. "They are punishing you because your husband is garbage," Claire said. "That is what is happening." Emily did not disagree. That afternoon, Emily called Laura Hensley. Laura was a divorce attorney based in Charlotte who specialized in complex marital dissolutions, the kind that involved significant assets, public scrutiny, and men who believed their confidence was a substitute for legal standing. Laura's office was exactly what Emily expected: minimalist, efficient, no decorative pillows, no inspirational quotes on the walls, just clean lines and closed files, and a woman behind a desk who looked like she had heard every story and believed approximately half of them. Emily laid out the facts without editorializing: the marriage, the affair, the funeral, the blog post, the trust, the job. She spoke the way her father had taught her to speak about difficult things, clearly, completely, without asking for sympathy. Laura listened. She took notes. When Emily finished, Laura said, "You have been preparing for this." "I did not know I would need to," Emily replied, "but I knew I might." Laura explained the legal landscape. The trust was untouchable. Mark had zero claim to it. The marital assets, the house, the shared accounts, those would be subject to division. But if Emily could demonstrate financial misuse, if she could show that Mark had spent marital funds on his affair, the division would shift significantly in her favor. Laura asked for documentation. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out a folder: bank statements, credit card records, emails she had forwarded to a secure account, the jewelry receipt from November, transaction records that showed hotel stays, restaurant charges, and a lease payment for an apartment Emily had never visited. Laura reviewed the materials for several minutes, then she looked up. "This is thorough," she said. "How long have you been collecting this?" "Since the receipt," Emily said. "About 4 months." Laura nodded. "We can work with this, but I need you to understand something. The strength of your position is your consistency. Do not escalate. Do not provoke. Do not give him anything that can be reframed as reactive behavior. Let the record do the work." Emily understood. Her father had operated the same way. Let the evidence speak. Let time do the sorting. Trust process over impulse. She drove home that evening feeling something she had not felt since the funeral. Not hope exactly. Direction. That feeling lasted 6 days. On Saturday morning, Emily checked the mailbox and found a thick envelope addressed to her. Inside was a legal filing. Mark had filed for divorce first. His petition described their marriage in language Emily barely recognized. He claimed emotional neglect. He claimed Emily had become distant and unresponsive. He claimed he had tried repeatedly to repair the relationship and been rebuffed. He framed himself as a man who had made difficult but honest choices. And buried in the third page, a line that made Emily's stomach drop. Petitioner requests full disclosure of any inherited wealth, trust assets, or transfers received by respondent during the course of the marriage. Mark had heard rumors. He did not know the number, but he smelled money. Emily sat in Laura's office the following Monday, the filing spread on the desk between them. Her voice cracked for the first time since the funeral. "He humiliated me at my father's funeral. He brought his pregnant mistress to the church. And now he is saying I am the one who failed." Laura leaned forward. "Emily, look at me." Emily looked up. "This is what they do," Laura said. "They write the story they need to believe. Our job is not to argue with his story. Our job is to make his story irrelevant. Here is something worth knowing. If you ever find yourself reading legal papers that describe your marriage in a way you do not recognize, where you are suddenly the villain in a story you lived honestly, know this: the filing is not the verdict. It is one person's opening argument. And arguments need evidence. Truth needs patience. Emily expected Mark to be the only adversary. She was wrong. Brooke Calloway was not the passive mistress Emily had assumed her to be. emboldened by Mark's public declaration at the funeral, by the legal filing that positioned him as the aggrieved party, and by her own growing anxiety about a future that depended entirely on a man she barely knew, Brooke decided to insert herself directly. The message arrived on Emily's phone at 9:43 on a Tuesday night. "Emily, I know this is hard, but Mark and I are building something real. I hope you can find peace. I genuinely do. Brooke." Emily stared at the screen for a long time. The words were polite, the tone was measured, and beneath every carefully chosen syllable was an assertion of territory so brazen it almost deserved respect. Claire, who was staying in Emily's guest room while the divorce proceedings were underway, read the message over Emily's shoulder. "I have never wanted to fight a pregnant woman before," Claire said. "Today is a first." Emily did not respond to the message. She screenshotted it instead. She forwarded it to the secure folder. She placed her phone face down on the table and breathed. Over the following 2 weeks, Brooke escalated. She began posting carefully staged photos on social media. Pictures of nursery preparations. Pictures of prenatal checkups, with Mark's hand visible in the frame. Pictures that told a story of domestic stability and new beginnings, authored by a woman who was 7 months pregnant by another woman's husband. Karen Fitzsimmons, whose social media surveillance capabilities rivaled those of a mid-level intelligence agency, reported each post to Emily with the dedication of a wartime correspondent. She posted a picture of baby shoes, Karen said over the phone, matching ones, and they were expensive. I checked. Emily did not ask how Karen checked. Some things were better left unexplored. Mark, meanwhile, grew increasingly confident. His attorney was building a narrative that required Emily to be the villain, the cold wife, the emotionally absent partner, the woman who had driven her husband into the arms of someone warmer and more available. This narrative required Brooke to be visible, sympathetic, and above all, permanent. Mark coached Brooke carefully. "Be kind," he told her. "Be the bigger person. People will see that." Brooke followed instructions. She smiled at strangers in public. She spoke about Mark with rehearsed warmth. She positioned herself as a woman who had found love in complicated circumstances and was trying to do the right thing. Emily watched all of this from a distance. She did not comment. She did not counterattack. She continued documenting. She continued meeting with Laura. She continued building a record that would speak when she chose not to. Claire kept her sane. They developed a routine during those weeks. Mornings were for logistics, phone calls with Laura, document reviews, financial comparisons. Afternoons were for normalcy. They drove to the grocery store, they cooked dinner, they watched television, and pretended to be two sisters living ordinary lives. One evening, Claire looked up from her laptop, where she had been printing bank statements, and said, "I cannot believe I am doing forensic accounting at 11 at night. This is what Dad trained us for." Emily looked at her sister. For the first time in weeks, she laughed. A real laugh. Brief, but real. Laura filed the counter-response on a Friday. The trust was cited as a premarital inheritance, protected by statute, entirely outside the marital estate. Mark's claim to disclosure was challenged on multiple grounds. His financial misuse was documented with transaction records, dates, and amounts. Mark's attorney contacted Laura within 48 hours. The tone shifted. The aggressive posturing softened. Mark was losing ground. Emily allowed herself to feel hope. Just for a moment, just enough to believe that the worst was behind her. Then Karen Fitzsimmons called. "Honey," Karen said, and her voice had the particular quality it only achieved when delivering catastrophic gossip. "I do not know how to tell you this, but Brooke is telling people the baby might not be Mark's, Emily's grip tightened on the phone. What? Apparently, she told 2 people at her prenatal class. It spread from there. The baby might be someone else's, someone she was seeing before Mark, or at the same time. The details are fuzzy. Emily sat down slowly. Her mind moved quickly through the implications. If the baby was not Mark's, everything shifted. Mark's attorney could argue the affair was less serious than documented. A brief lapse rather than a sustained betrayal. The financial misuse argument weakened if Mark could claim he had been manipulated by Brooke. The carefully constructed record Emily had built over months suddenly had a crack running through it. She called Laura immediately. Laura listened. Then she said, "Do not panic." This changes the tactical landscape, but not the legal foundation. The trust remains untouchable. The financial records remain valid. We adjust. We do not abandon. Emily tried to absorb that reassurance. She tried to hold on to the logic of it. Then it got worse. Mark's attorney filed an amended motion. Mark was now claiming he had been manipulated by Brooke, that he was a victim of both women, that his judgment had been compromised by emotional vulnerability following the death of his father-in-law. He was rewriting the story again. He was the victim. He was always the victim. And then Brooke made her own move. Panicking over the paternity rumors, desperate to control a narrative that was slipping away from her, Brooke contacted a regional tabloid blogger directly. She sold her story. She included private details about Emily, about the funeral, about the Whitman family. She exaggerated the wealth, hinted at secrecy, implied that Emily had known about the affair, and permitted it as part of some calculated scheme. The story went semi-viral. Not national news, but enough. Enough for Emily's name to appear in search results. Enough for strangers to have opinions. Enough for the private dissolution of a marriage to become a public spectacle. Emily sat in her father's empty house that night, surrounded by boxes she had not yet unpacked and grief she had not yet processed. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. The silence was the wrong kind, not peaceful, but abandoned. She called Claire at 2 a.m. "I cannot do this," Emily said. Her voice was raw. He turns everything into his story. Every time I think I'm ahead, he rewrites it. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Em, listen to me. He is not rewriting anything. He is flailing. Drowning people make a lot of noise. That does not mean they are winning." Emily pressed the phone against her cheek and closed her eyes. Claire continued, quieter now. "Dad built you a fortress. The walls are still standing. Mark is throwing pebbles at them and calling it a siege. Let him throw. When it feels like the person who hurt you keeps finding new ways to control the narrative, remember this. Narratives are temporary. Records are permanent. The loudest voice in the room is almost never the one the judge listens to." Laura Hensley did not believe in dramatic gestures. She believed in preparation, in documentation, and in the quiet, relentless accumulation of facts that made dramatic gestures unnecessary. When she filed the subpoena for Mark Garrison's complete financial records, she did it on a Tuesday afternoon with the same energy most people brought to ordering coffee. When the records arrived, she reviewed them with the focus of a surgeon examining X-rays, looking not for the obvious fracture, but for the hairline cracks that would prove the entire structure was compromised. What she found was devastating. Mark had spent $47,000 from the joint account on expenses directly related to his relationship with Brooke Calloway over a period of 9 months. Hotel stays in cities where he had no business obligations. Restaurant charges at places Emily had never visited. A lease payment for a 1-bedroom apartment in a complex 20 minutes from their home. Jewelry, clothing. A weekend trip to Savannah that Mark had described to Emily as a sales conference. Each transaction was documented with dates, amounts, and merchant details. Each one correlated precisely with the timeline of the affair, and each one used funds from an account that legally belonged to both Mark and Emily. But the financial records were only part of it. Laura had also obtained Mark's email correspondence through discovery. And Mark, who had spent months believing that nothing he wrote would ever be examined by anyone with authority, had been remarkably generous with his honesty. In one email to Brooke, sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, Mark had written, "Emily is dead weight. She has been for years. Once this is finalized, everything will be simpler. The money situation will correct itself." In another, to a colleague, Mark had complained about being stuck, about waiting for paperwork, about how some people pretended to be humble while hiding nothing worth finding. He had described his father-in-law as a nobody who lived in a shack and referred to the funeral as unnecessary theater. In a third email, sent the week after he filed for divorce, Mark had written to Brooke, "She thinks she can wait me out. But I know what I am worth, and I know what she is not." Laura spread these documents across her conference table and looked at Emily. "These are not confessions," Laura said. "They are better." Emily waited. "They establish expectation," Laura continued. "They show that he believes outcomes are owed to him, that he is acting in anticipation of authority he does not possess, that he views marital assets as his personal resources and his wife as an obstacle to be removed." She explained how courts interpreted such language, assumption of entitlement, particularly when paired with documented financial misuse, demonstrated bad faith. It showed intent. It revealed a pattern of behavior that went beyond infidelity into something more legally consequential, the systematic misappropriation of shared resources based on the unexamined belief that consequences did not apply. Emily understood. Mark's words did not need to condemn him explicitly. They only needed to reveal him accurately. Laura spent 2 weeks building the case file. She organized the evidence chronologically. Financial records first, then correspondence, then the social media documentation that showed Brooke's public positioning, then the tabloid story that demonstrated the lengths to which both Mark and Brooke had gone to control a narrative that was never theirs to control. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday. Mark arrived in a navy suit with his attorney beside him. He looked confident, which was unfortunate for him, because confidence without preparation is just a more expensive form of carelessness. Laura began with financial questions, simple ones at first. "How much do you earn annually? What are your monthly expenses?" Standard deposition territory. Mark answered easily, even expansively. He liked talking about himself. He liked the sound of his own competence. Then Laura shifted. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "when you brought Mrs. Calloway to your father-in-law's funeral, were you aware that your wife was the sole beneficiary of a $300 million trust?" Mark's attorney objected. Laura noted the objection calmly and repeated the question. Mark stared. "No, I did not know that." Laura nodded. "And when you filed for divorce claiming emotional neglect, were you aware that your personal emails described your wife as, and I am quoting your own words here, dead weight?" The room temperature dropped. Mark's attorney objected again. Laura waited. Mark said nothing. Laura continued. "And when you leased an apartment for Ms. Calloway, using funds from the joint account you share with your wife, did you consider that a marital obligation or a personal investment?" Mark's face went white. Not red, not flushed with anger. White, the color of a man watching the ground disappear beneath his feet. His attorney called for a break. Mark stood and left the room without looking at anyone. During the break, Emily sat in the hallway with Claire, who had insisted on being present even though she had no legal reason to be there. Claire handed Emily a bottle of water. "How do you feel?" Emily considered the question carefully. "I feel like Dad is in there," she said. Claire smiled. "He is. He built the case 30 years ago. Laura's just reading it out loud." When the deposition resumed, Mark's demeanor had changed. The confidence was gone. In its place was something Emily had never seen from him before: uncertainty. The unsettling awareness that the story he had been telling himself for months bore no resemblance to the story the evidence told. Laura continued for another hour. She asked about every significant transaction. She asked about every email. She asked about the timeline of the affair, the funeral, the amended filing. Each question was precise, documented, and impossible to deflect with charm. By the end, Mark's attorney was visibly recalibrating. The aggressive posture they had maintained since the initial filing was dissolving. The demands were narrowing. Reality was asserting itself in the places where confidence had once lived. When the deposition ended, Mark stood slowly. He looked across the table at Emily for the first time since the session began. Emily looked back at him with an expression that contained no anger, no satisfaction, and no pity. Just clarity, the same clarity her father had carried through every conversation, every decision, every quiet act of preparation that Mark had never thought to notice. Mark left without speaking. Laura closed her files. She looked at Emily. "This is enough," she said. "We can proceed whenever you are ready." Emily nodded. For the first time since the funeral, the path forward felt not just clear, but inevitable. The courtroom was smaller than Emily expected. She had imagined something grander, something that matched the scale of what had happened. Instead, it was a practical room with fluorescent lighting and wood-paneled walls that looked like they had been installed in the 1980s and never updated. The judge's bench was elevated but not imposing. The gallery had 12 rows of seating, most of them empty. Emily sat with Laura on one side of the aisle. Mark sat with his attorney on the other. Claire was in the gallery, 3 rows back, sitting perfectly still, with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for months. Karen Fitzsimmons was also present, which surprised no one. The judge reviewed the filings, the evidence, and the arguments that both sides had submitted over the preceding weeks. She asked clarifying questions. She referenced specific transactions. She quoted from emails that Mark had written carelessly and would now hear read back to him in a tone that carried the weight of legal record. Mark sat very still. The confidence that had defined his posture for months was gone. In its place was something smaller, something that looked like a man trying to occupy as little space as possible. Laura presented the case methodically. She walked through the financial records. She highlighted the pattern of misuse. She demonstrated the correlation between expenditures and the documented timeline of the affair. She presented the emails not as accusations, but as evidence of intent, of assumption, of a sustained pattern of behavior that demonstrated bad faith. She did not mention the funeral directly. She did not need to. The facts spoke in a language that did not require emotions to be understood. Mark's attorney argued for equitable division. He cited Mark's contributions to the marriage. He emphasized the duration of the relationship. He made arguments about fairness and partnership and shared sacrifice. They were competent arguments. They were also irrelevant to the central issue. The judge's ruling was decisive. The Whitman family trust was declared entirely outside the marital estate. Mark had no claim to any portion of it. The trust's structure, its timing, and its legal insulation were unambiguous. The judge noted that the trust had been established years before any marital conflict and was designed explicitly to protect assets from spousal claim. Marital assets were divided, but Mark's documented misuse of shared funds resulted in Emily receiving the significantly larger share. The judge cited specific transactions and specific emails. She referenced the apartment lease, the jewelry purchases, and the travel expenses that had been charged to the joint account while Mark maintained a parallel relationship. Mark was ordered to reimburse a portion of the misused funds. The amount was not symbolic. It was consequential. When the judge finished, the room was quiet for several seconds. Then administrative matters were addressed. Papers were passed, signatures were collected, Mark signed with visible restraint. His hand moved slowly across the page, as if the physical act of signing could be delayed enough to change the outcome. Emily signed steadily. Her hand did not shake. Afterward, they stood in the hallway outside the courtroom. Claire had positioned herself against the far wall, close enough to intervene, but far enough to give Emily space. Mark spoke first. His voice was quieter than Emily had ever heard it. "Your father planned this, did he not?" Emily regarded him calmly. "My father planned for me to be safe. Everything else you planned yourself." Mark shook his head. "I did not think you had it in you." Emily held his gaze. "I know. That is why it worked." Mark looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his face, not understanding exactly. Recognition. The belated awareness that the woman standing in front of him was not the woman he had married, or rather, that she was exactly the woman he had married, and he had simply never bothered to look closely enough to see it. He walked away. His attorney followed. The hallway was empty. Claire approached and stood beside Emily. Neither of them spoke immediately. Then Claire said, "Dad would have hated this hallway. Fluorescent lights, terrible acoustics." Emily laughed. The sound surprised her. It echoed off the wood-paneled walls and faded into the quiet. They walked out together into afternoon sunlight that was sharp and warm and completely indifferent to the proceedings that had just concluded inside. Brooke Calloway's tabloid story backfired in ways she had not anticipated. The blogger who published it had exaggerated certain details, misquoted others, and presented speculation as fact. When Laura Hensley's office issued a formal correction through proper legal channels, the blogger retracted the most inflammatory claims within 48 hours. The damage was not erased, but it was contained. The paternity test confirmed that the baby was Mark's. This resolved the biological question, but created new ones. Mark, whose legal strategy had briefly pivoted toward claiming he was Brooke's victim, could no longer sustain that narrative. The affair was real. The child was his. The choices he had made were unambiguously his own. Brooke found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The apartment Mark had leased for her was now subject to the court's financial orders. The payments had stopped. Mark, whose income was reduced by the reimbursement he owed Emily, could no longer maintain the lifestyle he had promised. The confidence that had attracted Brooke in the first place was gone, replaced by a bitterness she had not signed up for. Mark distanced himself from Brooke gradually, then abruptly. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became rarer. The future he had described to her in those late-night emails, the one where everything would be simpler, failed to materialize. Brooke was left alone, 8 months pregnant, in a complex whose lease was expiring, with a story she had sold to a blogger that now made her look foolish rather than sympathetic. Emily learned all of this secondhand through Claire and Karen Fitzsimmons, whose information network operated with a reliability that formal intelligence agencies would have envied. One morning, Claire mentioned casually that Brooke's mother had posted on social media asking for community support. Baby clothes, diapers, the kind of request that signaled genuine need rather than performance. Emily was quiet for a long time after hearing this. She sat at the kitchen table, her coffee growing cold, staring at a point somewhere beyond the wall. Then she said, "The baby did not choose any of this." Claire looked at her. Emily contacted Brooke's mother through an intermediary, not directly, not publicly. She arranged a small fund, not large enough to constitute reconciliation or forgiveness, large enough to cover medical expenses for the baby's first year. The arrangement was anonymous. Brooke would never know where it came from. Her mother would know only that someone had offered help without conditions. Claire watched Emily handle the logistics with her usual precision and said, "You are a better person than me." Emily shook her head. "This is not about being good. It is about not becoming something I do not want to be." In the weeks that followed, Emily moved through the practical aftermath of the divorce with the same methodical calm she had applied to everything else. She sold the house she and Mark had shared. The process was efficient. She did not linger over rooms or replay memories. She signed the papers, divided the proceeds as the court ordered, and moved forward. Her new apartment was smaller. It was intentional. The walls were bare when she arrived. The rooms echoed slightly. It felt like a place that had not yet been claimed by anyone's story, and Emily found that quality restful. She unpacked slowly over weeks rather than days. She placed items deliberately. She hung one photograph, a picture of her father standing in his backyard, holding a tomato the size of a fist, looking at the camera with an expression that suggested the tomato was the most important thing in the world. Claire helped with the move. She stayed in Charlotte longer than either of them had planned. The 5 years they had lost to stubbornness were not fully recovered, but they were being addressed, one conversation at a time, one evening on the porch at a time. One night, sitting on the small balcony of Emily's new apartment, Claire said, "Can I ask you something?" Emily nodded. "When did you know?" Claire asked. "Not about the affair. When did you know about Dad? About the money?" Emily thought carefully before answering. She owed her sister honesty, even when honesty was complicated. "The day after the receipt," she said. "When I found the necklace charge, I called Dad. He brought me to Daniel's office. That was the first time I saw the documents." Claire processed this quietly. "So you knew for months. Before the funeral, before the filing, before all of it." "Yes," Emily said. "And you did not tell me," Claire said. Not accusatory, just factual. Emily met her sister's eyes. "You were not speaking to me. And Dad asked me not to tell anyone. Anyone meant anyone." Claire nodded slowly. She took a sip of wine. Then she said, "He was protecting you from me too." "Not from you," Emily said. "From the possibility that someone might find out before the protection was in place." Claire was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I spent 5 years angry at him for being secretive. And his secrecy is the reason you are sitting here right now instead of fighting for scraps in a courtroom." Emily did not respond. Some truths did not require acknowledgement. They just required space. Mark attempted contact once after the divorce was finalized. An email framed as reflection. He spoke about regret, about misunderstanding, about how things might have been different if he had known more. Emily read the email once. She did not respond. She archived it and closed the folder. The impulse to reply, to correct, to explain was there. It existed briefly, like a match struck in a dark room. Then it went out. She understood now that Mark would always need an external explanation for internal failures. His version of events required her to be deceptive, so that he could remain unexamined. Emily declined the role. She had been cast in his story long enough. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Emily Whitman started a nonprofit. It was small, a single office in a converted storefront on a side street in Charlotte. 2 desks, a filing cabinet, and a coffee pot that worked intermittently. The organization provided financial literacy resources For women going through divorce, women who did not know how to read a bank statement, who did not understand what a trust was, who had never been taught that their signature on a document carried as much legal weight as their husband's. Emily did not attach her name publicly. The organization was called Whitman Resource Center, which people assumed was named after the poet. Emily did not correct them. She worked there 3 days a week. She answered phones. She organized workshops. She sat across the table from women who looked the way she had looked in Laura's office months ago, frightened, confused, and beginning to understand that the story they had been living was not the story they had been told. She did not offer pity. She offered information. She walked them through documents. She explained terms. She connected them with attorneys who worked on sliding scales. She told them, without drama, that knowledge was not power. Knowledge was protection. Power was what other people called it when they wanted you to feel guilty for having it. Claire visited monthly from Charleston, where she had returned, but with the understanding that distance no longer meant disconnection. They talked on the phone twice a week. They argued about small things. They laughed about smaller ones. They did not discuss the 5 lost years, except occasionally, in passing, the way you mention weather that is already cleared. Daniel Mercer sent Emily quarterly updates on the trust. She reviewed them carefully. She asked questions. She made adjustments when advisors recommended them. She did not expand her lifestyle. She drove the same Honda. She lived in the same apartment. She wore clothes she had owned for years. When Daniel asked once whether she planned to do anything different with the resources, Emily said, "I plan to make sure they outlast me." Daniel nodded. "Your father said something similar, almost the exact same words." Emily smiled. The resemblance to her father had never been physical. It was structural, and she had made peace with that. Karen Fitzsimmons remained a constant. She appeared at Emily's apartment every other week with food she claimed to have made, but had clearly purchased from the deli counter at Harris Teeter. She provided updates on neighborhood events Emily no longer attended, and gossip Emily no longer needed, but secretly enjoyed. Karen told her once, during a particularly animated report about a neighbor's landscaping dispute, "You know what I always liked about you, Emily? You listen like you are storing ammunition." Emily laughed. "I am just listening, Karen." Karen winked. "Sure you are." On the anniversary of Robert Whitman's death, Emily drove to the cemetery alone. The morning was cool. The sky was the particular shade of gray that March brings to the Carolinas. Not threatening, just quiet. She stood by his grave for a long time. She did not speak aloud. She did not bring flowers, because Robert had always said cut flowers were a waste of something that was better off alive. She brought instead a photograph, one she had found while unpacking. Robert standing in front of his first business, 1987. Young, thin, wearing a suit that did not fit well, and an expression that suggested he already knew it did not matter. She placed the photograph against the headstone. The wind moved softly through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a bird sang something repetitive and unremarkable that still managed to sound exactly right. Emily thought about what her father had given her, not the money, though the money mattered, not the trust, though the trust had saved her. What he had given her was a way of seeing the world that did not require performance, that did not confuse volume with value, that understood dignity as something you maintained rather than something you won. She thought about Mark, not with anger, not with forgiveness exactly, with the particular clarity that comes after a storm. When the air is clean and the damage is visible, and you can finally see the landscape for what it always was, rather than what you hoped it might become. Mark Garrison had believed that the loudest person in the room controlled the story. He was wrong. The person who controlled the story was the one who did not need to tell it, because the evidence already had. Emily stood at her father's grave for 15 minutes. Then she walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove to the Whitman Resource Center, where a woman named Sarah was waiting for her first appointment and had no idea that the woman who would sit across from her and explain the basics of asset protection was worth $300 million and drove a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the bumper. Emily parked. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. She looked the same as she always had, unremarkable, steady, present. She walked inside. The final truth is this: Emily Whitman never raised her voice. She never demanded respect. She never humiliated the man who humiliated her. She never performed her pain for an audience or her strength for applause, and yet she never lost a single thing that mattered. Not her dignity, not her future, not the quiet strength her father spent a lifetime teaching her to trust. Mark Garrison believed that confidence was a substitute for character. He believed that ambition excused cruelty and that charm could outrun consequence. He believed these things until the evidence made belief irrelevant. Brooke Calloway believed that love required no verification, that a man's promises were worth more than his patterns, that a future built on someone else's wreckage could somehow stand on solid ground. She learned otherwise, slowly and without mercy. And Robert Whitman, who never lived to see the resolution he had spent decades preparing for, was proven right about the only thing he ever truly cared about. His daughter would be all right. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was clever, but because she understood something most people learn too late, and some people never learn at all. Dignity does not require an audience. Justice does not require applause. And the most powerful victories are almost always the ones that never need to be announced. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever been the quiet one in a room full of noise, the one people underestimated because you did not perform your pain, then you already know what Emily knew from the beginning. Silence is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. And the truth, when it finally arrives, does not need your help to be heard. Drop a comment. Tell us where you are watching from and what time it is right now. And if you have ever been underestimated and came out the other side, this story was for you. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Closing disclaimer: this content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful storytelling with real-life lessons. Every character is fictional. Every emotion is intentional. And every word was chosen to remind you that your quiet strength is not a flaw. It is your greatest advantage. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next story.